Good morning students. Today we are going to discuss the 11th cranial nerve. This 11th cranial nerve is the accessory nerve, and this accessory nerve has two parts basically. One is cranial part which is arising within the cranium from the brain, and the another is the spinal part which is arising from the spinal cord. Now this cranial part, the efferent for this cranial part, they are starting from the nucleus ambiguous. So nucleus ambiguous, which is lying in the medulla, and from this nucleus the fibers, they leave the medulla by 4 or 5 rootlets and they join to form the single nerve root. And so that nerve is passing laterally towards the jugular foramen, where it joins the spinal part of the accessory nerve. So it is leaving the medulla between olive and inferior cerebellar peduncle. Now coming to the spinal part. The spinal part is arising from upper 5 cervical segments of the spinal cord. They are starting, or their nuclei or their bodies, they are lying in the ventral gray column, and they leave the spinal cord between the dorsal and ventral roots. So midway between these rootlets they leave and they ascend upward as the spinal part of the accessory nerve. Now this, as it is ascending upward, it passes through the foramen magnum and enter the cranium. Now after that, as it is entering into the cranium, it just turns towards the jugular foramen, where it joins the cranial part of the accessory nerve to form a single nerve which is given the name accessory nerve. So as it is passing through the jugular foramen and they just pass, you can say just below that jugular foramen, the cranial part and the spinal part of the accessory nerve, they just separate from each other. Now the cranial part of the accessory nerve, it joins the vagus nerve to give its supply to the pharynx, larynx and soft palate through the pharyngeal plexus. I told you in my previous lecture, the pharyngeal plexus is receiving the contribution from 9th, 10th, 11th nerve along with the sympathetic fibers. So through its branches, they are going to supply this, that is pharynx, larynx and soft palate. So these are the basically sensory branches which are going to supply these structures. Now the spinal part of the accessory nerve is just passing, or it has a course in the neck. So when it is passing through the neck, it is just passing behind the styloid process. Then it is passing behind the posterior belly of digastric. Then it just pierces the sternocleidomastoid muscle in the middle of this portion. So it supplies the sternocleidomastoid muscle. So once it is passing through the substance of that muscle, it enters into the posterior triangle. Now in the posterior triangle, it is running in relation to the levator scapulae muscle, which is present in the floor of the posterior triangle. Now once it is just passing to that at about 5 centimeter above the clavicle, so this nerve is going, or the fibers of this nerve is going to pierce the trapezius muscle to supply the muscle. So these two muscular branches are given by the spinal part of the accessory nerve. So definitely from this, if we know the anatomy or we know the course of this nerve, so we can understand if the damage it happens before it pierces the sternocleidomastoid muscle, so definitely these two muscles will go. So they will affect these two muscles. So once it is just the injury is happening in the posterior triangle, so this muscle is just spared because it has already crossed the sternocleidomastoid muscle and the trapezius will be the affected muscle. So no doubt these two muscles are also receiving the fibers from the cervical plexus, but the muscular branches are coming from this, and from the cervical plexus only the proprioceptive fibers, they reach to these two muscles. Now we know the injury to the sternocleidomastoid muscle, definitely it causes the wry neck, and trapezius muscle, if it is affected, so there will be the loss of shrugging of the shoulder, it happens. So these are the two applied aspects of these muscles. So this is all about the accessory nerve, which is very short and you can say very easy nerve to understand. But what is important at your level is that you should have the concept that it has two parts. Why these two parts are given the name cranial and spinal part. And after that, they just join, but they're carrying their fiber independently. Cranial part has the sensory fibers which are going to give the sensory supply to these structures. and the spinal part has muscular branches which is going to supply these two muscles. So thank you students, and I will request you that kindly subscribe my channel, like my channel and share it. Thank you very much.